Hi, my name is Autif Kamal, and this is episode 45 of Be Logical. This episode is about how generally higher education is more affordable to students coming from high-income families, not necessarily just because they have a higher income, but also because they're offered additional financial benefits from the universities. And I'll give you an idea of what I mean by that. Now first, I'm getting a lot of the information for this article from Karen Wise. She writes for Business Week. The name of her article is More Evidence That Colleges Are Giving Money to Those Who Need It Least. And implicitly, they're giving it to those who need it least rather than those who need it more, as in students coming from families of a lower income. She cites that from 2009-2010, parents' income and savings covered 37% of college costs, whereas in the school year of 2011-2012, it covered 27%. So that means they're having to pay more for higher education. However, the good thing is the amount that grant and scholarships covered went up from 23% to 30%. So that's good, but right now it's unclear whether higher income or lower income families are getting more of those grants and scholarships. So I will make that clear right now. So she states that 63% of lower income families receive annually an average of $6,170 in grants, whereas 19% of high income families receive on average per year $5,757. And also by low income families, she means those families that make $35,000 or less per year, whereas high income families make $100,000 or more per year. Okay, and in terms of scholarships, 35% of low income families receive $7,237 per year on average, whereas 36% of high income families receive $10,213 on average per year. Okay, now it's good that almost the same percentage of families, of low income families than high income families, are receiving scholarships. However, by default, there are less high income families than there are low income families. So I speculate that there are more lower income families that are receiving scholarships than high income families. However, there seems to be a disparity in terms of the amounts of the amount in scholarships that low income families receive as opposed to students from high income families. It's about a $3,000 difference. Why is there that difference? Now, some reasons for why universities would prefer students coming from high income families is, well, first let me get into the advantages, which you might already be clear about, of students coming from high income families. Students coming from high income families have greater resources. When I say resources, I mean they have a greater financial capacity to pay for tutoring, to pay for test prep, to pay for enrichment activities, and so on. And because they have a greater capacity, there's a greater possibility that their children will get better grades and will do better on standardized tests. So there's a better chance that they'll get scholarships, grants, and be admitted. Okay, and that also means that they'll be more. So basically, they'll be more appealing to top universities on the assumption that students from high-income families are taking advantage of their financial capacity, whereas low-income students coming from low-income families are less able to take advantage of that, if at all. Okay, from here on in, the information I'm getting it from the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. The name of the article is Disappointing Progress in Enrollments of Low-Income Students at America's Most Selective Colleges and Universities. Okay, so unfortunately, income does affect admission decisions. One reason that I speculate is that richer families have greater potential funds for the universities. I think that's something that universities consider. And you can think about it like this. Think about two universities. In one university, you have mainly students coming from low-income families. In another university, you have mainly students coming from high-income families. Okay, so I think in general, let's assume also that students going to each university cherish their universities equally. Now, in those scenarios, I think the students coming from high-income families will have a greater potential to donate to their university than students coming from low-income families. And I think that is a calculation that universities might make. I don't know for sure, but that's my guess. Okay, so at Harvard, 40% of financial aid recipients come from high-income families. Now, according to this article, students coming from families making $180,000 per year or more pay $18,000 out of $50,000 per year at Harvard. And also, it was stated that students coming from families receiving $200,000 or more receive need-based aid. Why is need-based aid going to families that make almost, more than 5 times than students coming from low-income families? I'm not sure why students coming from families receiving $200,000 or more are receiving need-based aid, but my inclination is to believe that they would actually not need financial aid if they're making that much money. But I'm saying this in ignorance of what their financial obligations are. But again, my other inclination would be that they would be able to reorganize what their financial obligations are. But again, I don't know what their situation is. Now this is really interesting. This article coming from the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education had an interesting table that showed of all the low-income students that they had, what percentage of them were receiving federal Pell Grants. These are need-based grants. Okay, at Harvard in 2007, 12.6% of low-income students received those grants. At Yale in 2007, 13.5% received those grants. Okay, now this is really interesting because Harvard has 40% of high-income families receiving financial aid, but they only have about 13% of low-income students receiving federal Pell Grants. I feel like there's a disconnect there, and that this number, the percentage of students receiving need-based grants, should be higher than the percentage of high-income families receiving financial aid. So I think that is a problem that should be addressed. Okay, so in summary, high-income families will generally have the upper hand because of, number one, they have a greater capacity to improve their children's academic learning, and also because universities, or at least Harvard, seemed more inclined to give financial aid to students coming from high-income families rather than students coming from low-income families. And that's only Harvard, but if there are other universities that operate just like Harvard, then that'll reinforce the point that students coming from low-income family are at a disadvantage, or at an even further disadvantage at getting an affordable education, since the financial benefits are not going to them, they're going to high-income families. And that's it for this episode. Alright, thank you.